And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to our program tonight. We've got a program called Climate Fraud Caught in the Act, and it is a program that we are going to be talking with Dr. Tim Ball and Mark Morano, who are both very familiar with the Michael Mann so-called hockey stick chart that happens to be really the foundation for the whole man-caused global warming, climate change fiasco, and I somewhat call it hysteria because it really is hysteria. And in a recent Canadian court ruling, Penn State's Michael Mann had sued Dr. Tim Ball and said that he had defamed his character, and that Dr. Ball, he had a lawsuit for several $1 million against Dr. Ball, and Dr. Ball defended himself in that court and asked only that the court require that Michael Mann produce the documentation, the scientific evidence that he actually had done the science that showed how his hockey stick was going to prove that we are in the warmest climate period in human history. And Dr. Mann failed to produce that information as ordered by the court, and therefore he is now in I guess the term that they used was he's in violation of the judge's order, and that he is in violation of the requirements of the court. First of all, let me introduce you, Mark. I see that Dr. Ball is trying to contact me. Would you like to give our listeners a little bit of your background so that we can get a little bit of an idea of what you've done through CFACT and the movie that you folks recently produced called Climate Hustle?
Yes, I'd like to say it drives the climate actors crazy. I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV. I'm not a scientist. I come to this whole issue as an investigative, not like a PhD scientist like a climatologist, Dr. Ball. But as an investigative journalist, I got involved in this. I got involved in environmental issues, and particularly the hyping of environmental issues for other agendas. And I started back in the 1990s with the Amazon rainforest scare. I actually did a documentary on that back then. And in doing that documentary, met with a lot of environmentalists who were just unhappy with the state of the environmental movement and how everything was basically, the science was bent, twisted, all for an agenda, whether it was raising money or whether, as I think you just referenced the phrase, global governance. And so what I ended up doing, did an Amazon rainforest documentary, and then I went and worked in the United States Senate, in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee as a communication director, speechwriter, and researcher, and ended up authoring a 700 dissenting scientist report for the U.S. Senate Committee. And in doing so, I met a lot of scientists and solicited the opinion of a lot of scientists. We issued that report. And then I from there, left the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works in 2009 and went on and started Climate Depot. And then last year did the film Climate Hustle. We released it in over 400 theaters in the U.S. and Canada. Just got back from Australia and a 3-city tour there. I've shown the movie at the EU Parliament. And the movie basically takes on Al Gore head on. We feature scientists in the film who voted for Gore, think he's a smart man, would vote for Gore again if he ran for president, but were appalled at his scientific presentation. And we go through all the myths of climate, which I'm sure Dr. Ball will because Tom will be able to talk about as well about the 97% consensus myth all the way through, and we show that it is about an agenda. The United Nations is very clearly calling for global governance. The head of the UN climate panel actually has said global warming is his religion. What other science panel have you ever heard of where the head of it talks about the science issue being his religion and his purpose for being in life? And we go into how they actually, UN officials have actually said we will redistribute wealth by climate policy. And that's their actual quote. It's not even environmental policy anymore. This is all about a different agenda. The former Czech president, Václav Klaus, has said since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the greatest threat the world faces is what he considers ambitious environmentalism through the climate agenda. In other words, they're using the climate scare to get a global governance and take away sovereignty and come after us. And in the UN Paris Agreement, which Donald Trump pulled us out of, the U.S. out of, was the most expensive treaty in world history, is the most expensive treaty. It so far estimated to cost $100 trillion to do nothing for the climate, even if you accept UN science and models and the country's pledges. It's pure medieval witchcraft to actually believe the treaty would have an impact. But it has a huge redistribution and global governance, and it's the model that they all want to go with, and the American left is livid at Donald Trump. So that's my opening filibuster. There you go.
Well, that's a good one, Mark, and thank you for doing that. I know that there are more and more of the scientists that are questioning the lack of scientific method behind the UN and IPCC claims. Is this maybe the missing link between the UN claims and those of the so-called climate deniers? And by that I mean this disproof of the hockey stick theory, because that seems to be kind of the basis of all of Al Gore's stuff and the IPCC and everything else, and it completely ignores the reality of the science that was part of our natural environment through the medieval warm period, through the Roman classical period. There are a number of times when the climate's actually been considerably warmer than it is today, but those are completely ignored in that hockey stick.
Yeah, actually, we'll get to the hockey stick one second, but in the film, I interviewed geologist Dr. Robert Giegengak, who notes that the geologic history of the Earth has been, we're in one of the 5 to 10% coldest periods in the Earth's history. In other words, 90% of the Earth's history has been warmer than today. It was not able to sustain ice at either pole. We are now in one of the colder periods in our history, and we actually have one of the lowest CO2 levels in the geologic history of the Earth. One scientist actually says we're in a CO2 famine. So back to your hockey stick question, what they needed to do to sell the scare, everything has to be unprecedented and first time ever, and this is record-breaking, and this is extreme. So we actually had a scientist when I was at the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee from the University of Oklahoma come testify. His name is Dr. David Deming. And let's go back to the first UN climate report in 1990. And by the way, just for your listeners to understand, the reason global warming is so big as a cottage industry is it's one of the few scientific issues that's ever had its own United Nations specialty group promoting it. It has all of academia. It has all of the mainstream media fawning over it. It has government grants. And it has educators in Hollywood and pop culture propagandizing it endlessly. So in order to sell that, the first UN report actually had an accurate chart. It showed the medieval warm period as much warmer than today. There was no hockey stick. And then even the 1996 report still had no hockey stick report. The first report was 1990. And then in 2001, something changed. Michael Mann came up with this hockey stick graph for the last 900,000 years in Northern Hemisphere, which showed temperatures stable. He got rid of the Little Ice Age. He got rid of the medieval warm phase from 900 to 1300 AD, followed by the Little Ice Age. It was all just one basic flat line, and then the 20th century unprecedented temperature. And the scientists we had testify said that in the mid-1990s, he was contacted by one of the climate activist scientists and said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. the climate establishment, which is running a campaign cause. Just think of the whole climate issue as a presidential campaign. The UN is sort of the PR organization. They basically just issue campaign talking points, and they suppress anything that's not flattering to their candidate or cause. That's how the whole thing runs. And the medieval warm period was driving them crazy. So literally, Michael Mann came onto the scene and did a whole bunch of statistical nonsense. And what happened was we actually had scientists call it statistical rubbish, was what one of the scientists called it. A German scientist, actually, Hans von Storch, called it that, and in his analysis. And then we had Canadians like Dr. Ross McKittrick and Steve McIntyre get involved. And they asked Mann for his data, and of course, as Dr. Tim Ball will testify, Mann doesn't like to give over any data. And it turns out this one chart erased all previous records of the climate, and this became their new talking point. It was featured a record number of times in the UN report itself. The media couldn't get enough of it. Finally, they had the talking point they'd been waiting for, and of course that was followed with all this hottest year, hottest decade, all nonsense, because they're within hundredths of a degree difference from previous years, and they're well within the margin of error of the data set. That's completely meaningless when you're talking to someone about global warming. It's the hottest year on record. Oh my God. Really? The data set, this is hundredths of a degree. They can't even measure the differences. It's utter nonsense. It's a political statement. But the hockey stick is one of the most critical factors in a campaign cause to sell the public that we caused unprecedented warming and that we had stable temperatures until mankind's CO2 emissions ended it. The climate has never been stable.
Right. It absolutely correct. And, it's interesting, but this whole process has been lubricated with lots of money and lots of funding from both government, but also a lot of environmental groups and a lot of foundations that seem to put an awful lot of money into the university systems. And frankly, if you don't agree with their claims that man is destroying the environment and causing untold amount of damage through global warming, that if you don't agree with that, you're not going to get the money. And so it's always back to the money. That seems to be the bottom line on that whole process. EPA was even asked to list carbon dioxide as a poisonous gas, which they did, and there's no legitimate scientific theory in that EPA finding. Carbon dioxide is essential for life on Earth. As you said, we're at one of the lowest carbon dioxide intervals or percentages in our Earth's history, and in fact, at many times in the past, we've had very much exponentially more carbon dioxide in the environment, and it's good for the environment. Am I correct on that?
Yes, carbon dioxide is a trace essential gas in the atmosphere that humans inhale oxygen. We exhale carbon dioxide. 400 parts per million is the current level. And it is just geologically incredibly low. We've had ice ages with many times higher carbon dioxide levels. We've had warmer temperatures with higher levels. There is no correlation in the geologic history of the Earth between temperature and CO2. So it's just astounding. But what they hang their hat on, so to speak, is carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So the idea is it can have a warming effect. Well, here's the problem with that idea and concept and theory, is that it's overwhelmed by hundreds of other factors. In other words, tilt of the Earth's axis, ocean cycles, water vapor, methane, cloud feedback, the sun, solar system, land use, deforestation issues. All of these issues can play huge roles in the global temperature. But what they've tried to do, even though the overwhelming majority of CO2 is naturally occurring in the environment, humans contribute a very small percent to the CO2. They've tried to say if humans can tweak at the margins this one variable out of hundreds, then we can come up with a solution to, quote, climate change. And we actually have a scientist in the film Climate Hustle saying this is, quote, scientific nonsense, unquote. You cannot, the idea that we're even having this discussion is an insult to all of our intelligence, but this is how they chose to do it. Now, you mentioned the EPA. Here's the scary part. The EPA under President Obama declared carbon dioxide a pollutant. And then the Supreme Court upheld that, so the EPA began regulating carbon dioxide, CO2, what we humans exhale. Humans were now toxic emitters of this pollutant, and that's how they were justifying shutting down American energy, American coal jobs. They were going after fracking. They were going after everything, justifying this, just shutting down American, anything carbon-based energy. Problem is, Trump came in. The good news is Trump came in and immediately overturned all that. The bad news is there's all these lawsuits now by environmental groups that because the rule is still on the books of the EPA that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and it's not easy to overturn because you got to go through a bunch of legal hoops and new studies, and because the Supreme Court validated that and has said that EPA can now regulate CO2 as a pollutant, it's possible that a judge of the Supreme Court even could force the Trump administration to start regulating CO2 and return to the Obama-era regulations again. So we're not out of the woods yet, and obviously that goes without saying for who the next president is. Frankly, any other Republican besides Donald Trump is going to cave to the green agenda, and maybe Ted Cruz would stand up to it. I don't think – I'm going to go through names here because I enjoy doing this because I'm sick of Republicans thinking that their leaders are any good. Marco Rubio would have caved. I can't imagine him pulling out of the UN Paris Agreement. Jeb Bush says he would have stayed in. Kasich would have stayed in. John McCain would have stayed in. Mitt Romney announced publicly he would have stayed in. You can go through the list of all the Republicans of recent years. They all would have caved and stayed into this. It's amazing that Donald Trump has the courage to stand up. And I think the only reason he has the courage is because he doesn't care what the Republicans think, and he actually likes, as Pat Buchanan said in the 1980s, we need politicians in Washington who treasure their negative notices in the Washington Post and New York Times. Well, we finally actually have a president who doesn't just treasure it, he seeks negative publicity from them and just relishes it. That is the most important thing a Republican president can have. Now, maybe not the most important, but one of the most important character traits a Republican president must have, and I've got to tell you, Donald Trump has it even more than Ronald Reagan had. Now, I'm not comparing Trump to Reagan because Trump doesn't have Reagan's ability to get things done in Congress, but Trump has the backbone and the principles to stand up, and he's doing everything he possibly can through executive order. He just doesn't have the ability yet to convince Republicans to go his way in Congress and House and Senate.
Well, we've got so many progressives in the Republican Party that, in fact, the Republican Party, in many ways, isn't much different than the Democratic Party.
No, and certainly not. None of the leadership is any different. I mean, Paul Ryan is really not significant any different. In the Senate leadership, Mitch McConnell is not any different. It's a ruling class in Washington. I mean, I hate to say that because it just sounds so cliched and rhetorical. But the reason they hate Donald Trump is and this is why Donald Trump's so weak. Even if Donald Trump's presidency in terms of success ended today in terms of just not getting anything else accomplished, he's probably the most successful president since Reagan. I'm willing to declare that tonight on your show, only because he's an alien political force that's just wreaked havoc on the media and on established Washington, and he's done a lot, as much as he can possibly do through executive order. Just the fact that he's just in there as a alien force wreaking havoc on the whole system and upsetting them on a daily basis, that you cannot put a value on that. It is so valuable, and if it can continue for 4 more years of just misery for the establishment and the media, then Donald Trump's presidency, it may have served a vital role in just causing a reset and just causing up a huge stink in Washington, which needed it.
Well, and I agree completely with that idea. And Mark, the thing that we have to realize is that this stuff that's in place right now that is so detrimental to our country and so antithetical to what our country was founded on, it was put in place over the last 10 or 15 years in a way. In fact, it's longer than that. It's 20 years, really. But it's been in place for a very long period of time, and it shows how the entrenched bureaucrats in agencies like the EPA and other executive offices, how they can control the dialogue and really control what the president does after they're in place.
Yes, and that's with a lot of these agencies and everything, NASA, EPA, it's very hard for new administrations to actually get control. State Department's another one, control of these agencies. You know, one of the bad picks Donald Trump did was probably Rex Tillerson for a whole bunch of reasons. But the number one reason is he just sort of represents that corporate elitist America that goes along because they think they can crush the competitors on everything from national health care to the UN Paris Agreement. And even the State Department has been very hard for anyone to control. The Rex Tillerson went off on his own under the Trump administration and signed some Arctic declaration with State Department bureaucrats that basically declared the U.S. is committed to the UN climate treaty. This is like a month before, maybe a few weeks before Donald Trump pulled out. He couldn't even, his own Secretary of State isn't even towing the line. And when you get into EPA, you get all these career bureaucrats which can put up all sorts of stonewalling. They've been openly defiant of the Trump administration appointees. Yeah, again, this is why I say this is all good because no other Republican would even attempt to fight it. And I'd love to go through, and George W. Bush was frankly pathetic. I mean, on this issue, I'll keep it narrow on this issue because he would send, and I would go every year in the United States Senate and then as a reporter to all these UN summits. He would send a whole U.S. delegation. They would rubber stamp the UN science, rubber stamp all their conclusions, and then and continue funding all this as well. But they never quite signed on to a UN agreement, but still they kept the whole process alive so that Obama could do it. And the other thing is George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, got us into the whole mess. He went down to the Rio Earth Summit during the election year, 1992, signed us on to this whole UN agenda, which brings us Agenda 21 and the whole sustainability thing, which then led to the UN climate treaty process. And this was ratified by the Senate. This is the reason we're in this whole mess. So it's just refreshing to have a non-Bush Republican in the White House, number one. And number two, what's up against him, it's hard to be optimistic. Maybe it's because I'm approaching 50. I was just at a whole event the last couple of days with college kids, and they're so optimistic and excited and ready to take on the fighting for liberty. It's just hard to see given the, we talked about the geologic history of the earth. It's hard to see given the history of the United States, how every president who's essentially elected has been to the left of the previous one in terms of the way they govern. Not even necessarily the president's fault, it's just the way the bureaucracy works, in terms of the size and scope of government. It's unlikely Donald Trump will be able to shrink the presidency. Ronald Reagan may have in his first term, but by his second term, things were coasting, and then George Bush continued and Clinton. So it's just an amazing thing to watch because it really does take away the hope that we're going to ever be able to just reverse all this because, frankly, the American public isn't behind it anyway. They like big government and they like all the expansion, the majority of them anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of a sad statement, but it is true that most Americans have lost that edge, I guess you'd have to call it, where they really were individualists and they really worked hard to try to do what they knew was the right thing, and they did have some concern about trying to be a republic and not a democracy, and we lost that edge a long time ago, and right now, you're right, most Americans are happy with someone thinking and taking care of them, and that is a pathetic state of mind. Now, I have to say, I have seen, though, with the Trump presidency, with the Trump election, there is hope because it's pretty obvious that Americans, more than 50% or right at 50%, are sick of all the propaganda, all the lies, all the fake media, all the fake news, and they're ready for some truth. And so, thank goodness, people like you and CFACT and Dr. Ball, and I'm at this point, he still is not on our call, and he's been trying for the last 35 minutes, 40 minutes to get on the call. So apparently there are some problems with our guest line. So. But in any case, there are people that are brave enough to tackle this issue head on, and you're certainly one of them, Mark, and thank you for that with your Climate Hustle movie. CFACT is an organization that is more than happy to tackle the thorny issues, And I think that America finally is at a point in our history, in our existence, where they are ready to hear the truth, whether it's convenient or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very hopeful, especially the whole movement that let Trump. I think the other thing about Trump, which I didn't mention, is the political correctness, going after cultural Marxism and saying offensive and obnoxious things and saying things that are frowned upon by the establishment. That's another important legacy of Donald Trump. I mean, the fact that they can't silence him and that he won't back down and that he doesn't cower at the threat of bad publicity and he said something politically incorrect. He seems to embrace it. And again, if nothing else, he's teaching liberty-loving politicians of the future how to handle the media in our pop culture.
Right. And I think there are a number of the young people. We recently had a program called the Red Pill Expo in Bozeman, Montana, and we had pretty much a sellout, a full house. And I was very pleased to see that I would guess somewhere around 30 or 35% of the people attending that conference were 35 years and younger. And that's the first time in so many conferences that we had that number of young people in our audience. So it tells me that America is finally waking up, and I think that the young people, the teenagers and the young adults right now are at a point where they realize something is wrong, and they're ready to step out and maybe take on the establishment.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. There's many foot soldiers, but I guess the reason I said I was not optimistic is they get duped by the Republican Party, and they get caught up. I mean, 5 years ago, everyone thought Paul Ryan was this great conservative, and then he gets full power, and people realize he's not going to do anything. And I think what happens is the Republican Party is very powerful and effective at misleading and deceiving young liberty-minded activists and then turning them into basically they turn it into just sort of a status quo and then a pro-party position, and you end up compromising and everything just falls apart. And meanwhile, the country chugs along and we're following the path of Europe and everything else. So it's a huge battle. Bill Nye, the science guy, to return back to climate for a minute, but on the same relevant point, had said that we'll be able to achieve the full global warming agenda when the older skeptics die off. We just have to wait. And the reason he said that in his mind was because the kids have been propagandized by climate from kindergarten all the way through college, and it's very effective. They're told that you have to be the good steward. You turn in your parents if they don't recycle. You rat out people for, kind of like it'd be a good green brown shirt, if that makes sense. That basically that rats out other people if they don't follow the green agenda, and these kids are indoctrinated. Polling data bears that out. Young people are more believers, and as you get older and more life experiences, you're less likely to be duped. But they're actually the climate during the global warming debate. This is recognized that they have to go after the kids, and Leonardo DiCaprio himself has said we have to get kids young. Al Gore's producer, Lori Davids, told her daughters, "We want you to grow up to be activists." And this is how the Weather Channel is going, featuring kids going home and telling their parents there's a climate crisis, we have to act, and you got to do all these little religious-like symbolic gestures, everything from recycling to turning off the light switch, unplugging your phone charger, and you do it. As you do it, you're supposed to think about you're stopping global warming by doing it. I mean, this is really getting into it's just a powerful, symbolic, religious type message that's being indoctrinated in kids. But you're right. We have free will, free minds, and we can overcome it. The problem is we have all these great movements. They elect Donald Trump. They elect Ronald Reagan. But frankly, if you look later, they just don't seem to stick in the United States anyway.
Right.
And if you look around the world, it's hard to find places, unless you have a total collapse of a system, it's usually liberty doesn't come incrementally. If we're following the path of Western Europe, we may have at best a Reagan's first term where you can take a step back, but it just seems to resume and go normal. So I guess I'm at the age now where I don't like, to imply that, I don't want to call it false hope, but I want to be as realistic as possible and tell people how they're being duped and deceived. Because I guess you're sensing the bitterness in me. I am angry as a young college Republican activist who got involved and really thought that politics was going to roll back government. You know, I can't even listen to politicians talk now. That's why, to me, Donald Trump was great because he was, and I'll say it on the air, the FU to the system. I won't say the F word, but that was the number one reason I supported Donald Trump. And it was mostly not even the system, but it was more to the Republican Party. And he's serving the role that I voted for brilliantly so far. And that's why I'm very happy with him. But I don't know where that gets us in the long run, if we actually can achieve rolling back, you know, this huge central planning state.
Well, I couldn't agree with you any more than I do, because the bottom line is Donald Trump has upheld what he ran for, and what a refreshing change to actually have someone run for political office and they do what they said they were going to do. Now it's time for the Republican Party and for liberty-loving patriots all over this nation to get behind that gentleman and insist that so many of these things that we're dealing with right now, that those Pandora boxes be opened, that we start to deal with the administrative bureaucracies, that we get rid of so many of the Obama appointees that are still filling many of the administrative agencies that Trump is trying to deal with. And it's time for Obama to get lost, and it's time. And when I say that, I mean he had his turn. Now it's time to leave and let the new president fill those administrative offices, those various slots, with new forward-thinking people that understand that what we were going through is antithetical to a constitutional republic.
I agree. And, the other thing that's not politically correct to say, and directly on your point, John McCain, love the guy, American hero, great service, courage. But in terms of politics, I think Arizona would be, if he is one of the biggest obstacles right now to getting anything done. Obviously, he and the Maine senator and Alaska Senator Murkowski. Mm-hmm. But I mean, those 3 votes, particularly on the Obamacare, which was a meaningless, not a meaningless vote. It was all about political momentum. But it's just a situation now where if Donald Trump doesn't succeed, and here's the problem, we could just end up in 4 years with, at this point, we could end up with President Gore. There's all kinds of rumors that he may run. Tom Hanks may run. Donald Trump may have actually inspired the opposite end of a lot of liberal celebrities trying to run. I don't know how well they would do. Someone like Tom Hanks is well liked, and who knows who they could end up recruiting. Michael Moore is pushing him. But unless we can have a cemented legacy here, this was interesting and fun with Donald Trump, because all these executive orders, everything he's doing could just be overturned by the next president in the next few months, another type Obama or whoever was elected. So, and this is what ultimately they want to do. And just to get back to the climate issue, by having the United Nations Paris Agreement, the whole premise of this is free people can't make decisions in their own lives on what appliances to use, what light bulbs, what diet they should have. They're already talking about the cattle being more destructive to the environment than all the transportation sector. They want to get rid of people eating meat. They want to go after our transportation means. They want to make everything. There's actually proposal to build cities modeled after termite nests. The idea this is the ultimate in smart growth, where everyone's just going to be concentrated in city centers and with all public transit. And then they're going after reproduction now. We have Bill Nye the Science Guy, a guy named Travis Reed, the Sierra Club. They're favoring and talking glowingly of the one-child policy in China, and we can't have kids because of global warming. They're going after, today, a study by UCLA going after dogs, cats, pets, talking about how they're serious contributors to global warming. Once you turn over more and more your rights to international bureaucrats like the UN Paris Agreement, you are talking about bureaucrats being able to weigh in, penalize you, tax you, and ban you from doing things that we've taken for granted our whole lives and for generations. And that's ultimately where this climate agenda is going, because they think free people left to themselves will destroy the earth. But the reality is, as you go back to Paul Ehrlich's overpopulation scare, it was always the same solution but a different environmental scare. So back then it was always we need central planning. He was calling for forced sterilization agents in the water. But no matter the eco scare going back to the 60s, it was always the same solution: more government, more central planning, less freedom, less choice. And that's basically where we are. The latest scare that they're using to force the same agenda is the climate scare, and they're all in on this one like they've never been on any previous scare. That's why this is the most important environmental issue in the history, not because it's real scientifically, but because this is what you think of it like a poker game. They went all in on their chips, and they're not backing down. And no matter what Donald Trump can really do, the issue is not going to go away. Again, United Nations behind it. The United Nations was formed in 1988, the climate panel, and their mission was to look at how CO2 impacts climate. Well, if they failed to find CO2 having a huge impact, they failed to have a reason to exist. They failed to have conferences in Bali and Cancun and Kenya and all these exotic places around the world, and they fly around to multiple conferences, several times a year. And if they fail to find that, not only do they do that, but they also fail to be in charge of the solution. So they get to come up with the problem, they get to say how bad it is, and they actually say how bad it is before that happens. They'll say things like UN officials are on record as saying, just wait till the next UN climate report. It'll be so bad the world will have to act. It's like Babe Ruth pointing out where he's going to hit the ball. They know where the science is going to be years ahead because it's a campaign cause of talking points. And so once they do that, their agenda is very transparent, very clear. The head of it, I always say her name wrong, but Christina Figueres, she just stepped down as the UN climate chief. She actually said we need a, quote, centralized transformation, actual quote, that will make life on planet Earth very different in order to fight climate. And you tell people, well, the UN's trying to control, oh, you're a conspiracy nut. No, I just quoted you the exact words of the UN climate chief, and they said they want a centralized transformation that will make life on Earth, planet Earth, very different for everyone in order to fight global warming. What part of that is unclear when you give them more and more power? That's their goal.
Right. Well, and most people don't want to believe it because they couldn't possibly do that. Well, guess what, folks? They are doing that, and Christina Figueres, I think that's how they pronounce it. Yeah. I use that quote because I have a friend who is the head of the forestry stewardship program in Montana here. And she sent me an email, and it was from a lady who is a writer for a newspaper, Yale University newspaper, and her request was to find some Montana climate deniers so that they could have a discussion with the enlightened about climate change. And this lady friend of mine knows exactly how I think on everything, and she's actually one of us. But she sent that to me, and she said, are you interested? And I said, boy, howdy. So I sent back a note to this lady from Yale University and said I would be more than happy to be part of this discussion. I think it's time for some honest discussion in science and less of this hysteria that seems to permeate the entire so-called global warming debate or dialogue. And I used her quote at Doha about it's not about the climate, it's about redistribution of wealth. I also used Othmar Edenhofer's quote, who was the head of the IPCC report, when he said that it wasn't about climate, it was about redistribution of wealth. Yeah. I used those quotes and I sent that back to this lady, and she sent back a very quick reply Well, we'll keep your name handy, but this really isn't what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And I just thought,
yeah.
I guess not. You don't want somebody that can debate. You want somebody that will just act like a toady and go along with whatever you guys want to throw.
That's how it always is. I've had, I can't tell you how many TV debates on Fox, on China TV, on CNN, on MSNBC. For young producers say, hey, we're going to have a climate debate. Would you be willing to debate? I'm like, oh, yes, absolutely. And then they try to find someone. They can't, end up canceling the segment. Or many times they find someone, and then at the moment of, this happened with the guy named Dan Weiss, Center for American Progress, the Soros-funded group. I showed up at the studio, and they tell me right before that he refuses to appear on camera with me. We have to do 2 separate segments, that he won't appear with me because he doesn't want to legitimize the skeptical position. Bill Nye, the science guy, after I debated him one time in primetime on CNN, I ended up debating him again on Fox News in primetime on John Stossel. And CNN ended up wanting to have me back on, and they kept saying, we have someone here, and it was obvious that when they couldn't get anyone, they wanted to get out of it, but they didn't want to tell me they couldn't find anyone to debate me, so they just kept keeping me hanging, and I kept agreeing to whatever absurd terms that they had, and it kept getting to the point where it was like I was 0 for 9 for schedules, and sometimes I would actually show up at CNN, and then the section would be canceled. I mean, this is a true story. I was 0 for 9 with fake debates that they kept saying they were going to set up, and it never happened because they couldn't find anyone, or people would agree, and then someone would talk about it. This happened with James Cameron, the director of Avatar. He said, I'm going to get the deniers out on the street and have a shootout with them, metaphorically, and all this stuff. So his people contacted me from Hollywood, and they were having a big, it was in Aspen, Colorado, big eco-conference. They wanted skeptics to show up. I arranged for Andrew Breitbart and Ann McElhaney from who did the new
yep, I know her well.
What's the name of that movie? About the abortion doctor in Philadelphia. My mind's blanking, but you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And then we were all set up, and someone got a hold of James Cameron and said, you don't want to do this debate. And he backed out, but and we knew this from other channels, but the organizers didn't want to admit that the man who called us out into the street to a debate turned chicken all of a sudden. And by the way, he did Titanic, which is Leonardo DiCaprio. I'm king of the world, so I said that James Cameron had gone from king of the world to chicken of the sea, like the tuna, because he was backing out of the debate. I didn't find out till my plane landed in Denver, Colorado, to switch planes to go to Aspen, that the debate was officially canceled. They kept, and this is one of those situations where they kept changing the terms constantly, and we immediately knew what they were up to. We thought it was hilarious because they didn't want to admit he backed out. So we agreed to every wacky, ridiculous change, constantly changing venues, times, and they just kept saying, well, we understand if you don't want to do it. No, we'll do it. So it finally ended up with me landing at the airport, and then they backed out. That's how absurd it is. And then, of course, they were forced to give me a venue to just present, and they packed it with people that, booed and hissed, and I was constantly interrupted. It was kind of pointless. It was just a one-man thing. I was a one-man discussion instead of the debate that they promised me.
Well, Mark, that's funny because the same thing happened with Lord Monckton. He was actually brought to the Senate, to the Congress, and was going to debate Al Gore before the U.S. Senate, and they wouldn't let him into the building. He was not. It's the first time that's ever happened.
Yeah, actually, first of all, I've known Longton for years. We've traveled to South Africa, South America. I've been to many UN conferences with him, and actually, that was my exclusive story. That was from I want to say it was 2009. I can't remember what month. But he was scheduled to appear. He flew over from the UK. He's from England. He landed at the airport, and upon landing, he found out that the Republicans, this is 2009 now, the Democrats controlled the House. They had a House hearing with Al Gore. Republicans are supposed to get to pick whoever they want. Well, the whole hearing was threatened basically to be canceled unless the Republicans got rid of Monckton, the Democrats who controlled the hearing. And so Monckton, again, weak Republicans, they should have held an alternate. The Republicans, had they been strong, would have held their own separate hearing even out of the Congress and raised the fact that Al Gore was afraid to have him appear. Instead, they canceled Monckton, and then Monckton was left just talking to the new media, the mainstream media didn't care that Al Gore had done that.
Right. Well, and, that's obvious that they don't want to talk about these issues, but yet on March 29, 2016, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but that group of progressive state attorneys general, Al Gore and a bunch of elected officials formed a group called AGs United for Clean Power, and they threatened to file charges against ExxonMobil and other climate change deniers using RICO statutes.
Yeah, actually, I showed up at that press conference at the end. I was interviewing Bill Nye, the science guy, in Central Park. We got stuck in traffic. I missed the actual. I got to right at the end of the press conference. I missed the actual discussion with.
Well, I sure wished you had been at that one, because that was dynamite. A dynamite place to be able to question how they think they can literally step on our entire U.S. Constitution and free speech and the right to defend ideas that you believe without, it's ridiculous. RICO statutes? I mean, come on, guys. And they were leveling that at ExxonMobil, and maybe that's the reason that Rex Tillerson was kind of rolling over to the climate folks.
Yeah, I mean, that's just scratching the surface, the RICO thing. Now, I've interviewed Senator Whitehouse at the People's Climate March. He's absolutely, from Rhode Island, he's absolutely backing the idea that they should be prosecuted, skeptics, energy CEOs, for fraud. Here's their basic line. If you don't agree with Al Gore and the United Nations, you're either an idiot or you're knowingly deceiving, because no rational human being could disagree with the overwhelming evidence with 97% of the scientists, blah, blah, blah. That's the gist of it. So we had NASA's lead global warming scientist, Dr. James Hansen, a man who called for crimes against humanity. Well, he was NASA's lead. People will say, well, wait, NASA put men on the moon. You don't trust NASA? Actually, no. The men who put the NASA employees and scientists and engineers who put men on the moon have come out and formed a group called The Right Stuff, hundreds of them, and they're now opposed to what NASA's scientists are claiming on global warming. So actually, the men who put man on the moon, it actually thinks what NASA's doing is a disgrace to the agency by promoting this. So the head, and the other thing is, oh yeah, NASA's not some dispassionate, scientific-minded body when it comes to climate. Their head was James Hansen. He called for crimes against humanity against skeptics. He was arrested at least half a dozen times protesting global warming, taken away in handcuffs. This is the level that we have as a scientist activist. And he endorsed a book, which is still available on Amazon, his review. The book was by Keith Farnish, and it was called For Ridding the World of Industrial Civilization. It called for leveling dams, blowing up cities in order to turn off the greenhouse gas machine. NASA's lead global warming scientist praised the book and said the author has it exactly right. This is what we're dealing with. NASA's agency was hijacked by someone who could have sounded like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. This is what they sounded like. And people say, oh, well, this is from NASA. Don't you respect NASA? Frankly, no. You see who's in charge of it? The current guy is a guy named Dr. Gavin Schmidt. He was on John Stossel. He was supposed to debate climatologist Dr. Roy Spencer. They did a bunch of musical chairs. He refused to appear with them. So Stossel's producer filmed the NASA scientist walking out on the set talking to Stossel, and then he would have to walk off while the other climatologists, skeptical climatologists, walked on. This is the level how afraid they are. They think, frankly, their excrement doesn't smell somehow, that the other person, because they're a skeptic, aren't worthy to be on the stage with someone as esteemed as them. And this guy, Gavin Schmidt, has a website called realclimate.org. And it was set up to just propagandize the notion that all scientists agree. Their most recent post on climate was last week, and it actually said, the evidence is overwhelming. We know global warming is real because, and it said that all the major science academies have endorsed global warming. And you're like, oh, wow, that's really intimidating. How can we handle it, all those thousands of scientists? Until you realize it's total bunk. Yes, the science bodies have endorsed global warming, but scratch it just for it's lighter than you'd scratch an instant lottery ticket, and you'll find out that it's horse SH. I won't say the word.
No,
but here's the deal.
We'll keep that. Yep.
Yeah. All of these groups, National Academy of Science, American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, it's 24 or less governing board members basically coming up with a statement that sounds similar to the United Nations or Al Gore, and those governing board members vote on it. The tens of thousands of scientists rank and file either are not even informed, aren't even aware of it, and never have an actual vote on the statements. So what happens is you have things like the American Meteorological Society, surveys showed up to 75% of the scientists were skeptical. But the 24 governing board members towed the line. So the media has their talking point. Tens of thousands of scientists endorsed the United Nations report today. They did? Oh. And then you have people like Dr. Richard Lindzen of MIT, the skeptical scientist, has pointed out the groups at the National Academy of Science took $3 million. This was actually in the Washington Times and reported by some outlets a few years back. And then the Academy, the National Academy of Science, is an esteemed science body started by Abraham Lincoln. People always mention that because you can't be against that, right? Because it was started by Abraham Lincoln. They took $3 million from Congress and then lobbied for a cap-and-trade bill. And Richard Lindzen, his actual quote was to make fun of this. He said, if Congress wants the National Academy of Science to say climate is a problem, by golly, they paid them to say it, and they'll say it. So people get caught up in this like, well, these are esteemed scientists from the National Academy, tens of thousands. No, 24 governing board members, steeped in politics, steeped in political correctness, are answering their paymasters at Congress and whoever the administration is, and they're saying what they need to say to keep funding alive. That's literally and I really feel like I need to curse, but that's literally the nonsense you're being fed by NASA's lead global warming scientists when you hear this stuff. So people actually, if you're not in tune to this debate, you're kind of like intimidated, like, oh, the National Academy of Science started by Abraham Lincoln and NASA, the people put me on the moon, they agree with that. It's just this whole house of cards they set up. And it's exhausting because you can debunk it 100 times, and then you just come back like a hydra. The whole thing just keeps coming back and back and back and back and back and back. You caught me in a weird mood tonight. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm upset.
Because you've made this a very lively and interesting discussion. And, gee, I wished I could find something I didn't agree with. The fact is you're saying an awful lot of the same things that I feel and think and hear. And, the science is not there. And if, in fact, they would sit down and have a fair and honest and open public discussion in front of the American people, in front of the world, with real scientists and not all the name calling and all the, the so-called climate zealots that just completely try to debunk anything anyone else says, and had an honest debate, would win the debate, hands down. There's no question about it.
Well, you said one thing I want to correct you on. You said if. There is no if. They did it. They did it in 2007 in New York City. They had Philip Stott, a UK scientist, against the aforementioned Gavin Schmidt of NASA, the lead global warming scientist, Michael Crichton, Richard Lindzen, and then two other people who I don't even remember the names. But it was 3-on-3. They polled a tough New York City liberal audience before the debate. Was global warming a crisis? Overwhelmingly, the audience voted it was a crisis. 90-minute debate, 3-on-3. Guess how they voted? Three skeptics reversed hundreds of New York City residents and flipped them to say global warming wasn't a crisis after the debate. And do you know what NASA's lead global warming scientist said and what marching orders he issued after that debate? He said, we were basically clobbered. We were terrible, and these kind of debates do not serve our interest. And he then recommended and sent out the marching orders that those kind of debates were to be no more. And I got to tell you, there have been no more of those kind of public debates. They stifled them and shut them down. So I don't mean to correct the host here, but I just wanted to say there wasn't an if. There wasn't an if. There actually happened. And that's available, by the way, on YouTube. People can go back. It's 10 years old now. And watch it. But it was a powerful moment. And I wrote about that when I was in the U.S. Senate. It was a powerful, and they've stuck to their guns. They don't debate because of that debacle. I mean, again, just to reiterate, hundreds in a New York City audience overwhelmingly voted it was a crisis. In 90-minute debate, they flipped. A New York City audience, if you can flip an audience of New Yorkers on global warming, you can pretty much do anything. And so they were terrified, and that was the end of debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they were, and you're exactly right. That was at Columbia University, and when they did that discussion, they went in. There were somewhere around 30% that didn't think that global warming was a major crisis, and 70% believed that it was. And when they came out, the numbers were almost exactly the opposite.
Yeah, they flipped it.
Yep, they flipped it. And as you say, if they can do that in New York and at Columbia University in a very public debate, obviously they're going to lose it every time. And that is the reason that there's so much shrill and hateful dialogue that's directed to anybody that doesn't toe the company line, you know. They want people to believe this crap, and they figure anybody that's going to stand in line and say, wait a minute, that's not correct, they're going to try to do what they can to destroy that person so that nobody listens to what they have to say. And all I can say is that anybody that believes that there should be a double standard where if you're liberal, everybody should listen to you, and we should treat you with kindness. And on the other side of that coin, anybody that disagrees with that ought to be treated like a pariah and called names and everything else. There's something wrong with the left if that's the way they really feel.
Yeah, actually, there's two. When I talk to the sort of the general public who doesn't really follow this issue very much, the two reasons and it's always surprised me because I always looked at it from a scientific UN agenda, but it's interesting that the two reasons the general public, the non-specialists will say about climate and why they're skeptical is A, the people promoting it don't follow the lifestyle. In other words, they see Leonardo DiCaprio, the UN chief, they see Al Gore, and they just laugh. And they say, when they start living like they believe there's a crisis, then I might take them seriously. And that's always been just a huge, surprising issue with that. And what was the other thing you said? I was about to give you the second reason, but you said, what was your other point? What was the point you just made?
Well, they just seem to be able to call us anything and deride everything that we talk about as being totally ridiculous. Well, if it is, why won't they sit down and have an honest debate?
Yes, and that is the second reason the general public will tell me, and I bet people all over the place working in the Senate everywhere, is they'll say, I don't take this seriously, and I'm skeptical because they won't debate it, and they call you guys deniers. Lord Monckton, actually, in my film Climate Hustle, you'll hear him say that they'll say he met people in England who said we saw the reaction that the environmentalists had to you, and that was our first clue that you were right because they were so over the top and hysterical. And that's what gets people when you have a climate debate, and one side is saying, these are climate deniers. Make no mistake, this is a Holocaust denial reference. In fact, in our film Climate Hustle, we actually have a UK professor saying you have a Holocaust deniers on one hand and you have climate deniers, and there's no difference between the two. And then you have comparing us to Hitler. You have Bernie Sanders in the movie comparing us to Hitler. You have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. saying that we belong at the Hague with 3 square meals in a cot. You have Bill Nye echoing that sentiment, saying that jail is legitimate if you're committing fraud, and of course you're committing fraud if you don't agree with Al Gore and the United Nations. Right. Something's wrong with you, and you're deliberately lying, or you're a complete moron. That's basically their message. That resonates with the public. That one side is not willing to debate and is willing to. And basically, here's a simple answer. One side of the debate wants to label, name call, and jail and prosecute, and there's even called for the death penalty by some of the extreme environmental activists. So which side are you going to believe has more reasoned scientific approach? And that's done them more harm. And Bill Nye just added to that by saying he wanted to, we have to wait for the climate deniers to die in order to move forward here. It's part of that whole theme where it's debate, intimidation, and it's how they do it. This is how they want to run this whole debate. And I'll say one other thing here. one of the biggest factors right now, I could say some negatives about Trump. My biggest disappointment, two disappointments when it comes to climate. Instead of just pulling out of the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, doesn't take effect until November after the next election in 2020, and that's a true statement, given the process by which Trump has chosen, he could have pulled us out of the United Nations, the UNCC, or whatever it's called, the United Nations treaty process, which George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, got us involved in the Earth Summit. If Donald Trump had pulled us out of that, it would have been very controversial. We could have got out of it. Then, in order to get back in, you would have to have a new treaty ratified by the Senate. That's how Obama got away without, at least short term, there's been lawsuits pending, but got away without having the Senate ratify this Paris Agreement because he said it was merely an update to the existing treaties originally ratified under George H.W. Bush. So
well,
Donald
actually,
Trump yes.
Yeah, no, Mark, I have to tell you, it was never ratified. Dr. Michael Kaufman and Kay Bailey Hutchison actually appeared on the floor of the Senate and testified against it and showed the violence map and what they were doing with that. And the Senate voted 98-2 to reject that treaty. And so then Bill
there was
Clinton
some framework
put it in through the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And he's the one that put it into the administrative agencies. Now, Bush wanted to go ahead and put it through, but it didn't work when it went to the Senate.
So you're saying they didn't vote? I have to go back. Yeah, you're gonna. I apologize if I'm incorrect on that. I thought there was at least one aspect of that treaty that the Senate actually ratified, and maybe because Bush was touting it as non-binding and all this other stuff, which turns as nonsense. That's how they get the camel's nose in. But I thought there was a Senate vote that actually either endorsed or ratified that treaty. I'd have to look that up. We should find out. I stand corrected if I'm wrong on that point.
Well, they didn't ratify it, but knowing some of the Senate the way they are, I think they may very well say, well, we endorse it, but we won't ratify it or something to that effect. But,
I will have to look that up.
But that Bill Clinton put it into all of the various administrative agencies, the EPA, the Agriculture Department, all the different departments actually implemented it under the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And that happened in 1994, I believe. So even if it wasn't ratified by the Senate, it became, in effect, law just through administrative fiat.
Yes, that's definitely true. But I'm going to make sure I'm giving you that I'm right on this. Let me just see. Entered in the fourth. I'm sitting there doing a Google search because I really thought this was ratified. But all right, I don't want to waste time.
That's okay because that's a good discussion, a good debate. But
from what I understand, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, if Donald Trump had pulled us out of that whole, gone out of that treaty and overturned that, went after the heart of it, withdrew from that portion instead of just the Paris Agreement, then the next president would have a much harder time. And he sort of took the easy way out, Donald Trump. In fact, we may never actually be out of the Paris Pact. It depends on if Donald Trump wins re-election or who the next president is. And the other thing he's not done well is they're trying, his EPA chief, Scott Pruitt, and Rick Perry, to a lesser extent, are trying to actually have a climate debate. They're calling about red team, blue team, and all that stuff, which is an okay idea, but it's no panacea. They're trying to tout it. It's a way for politicians to duck cover right now. The single greatest thing Donald Trump could do for the scientific debate of global warming is appoint Princeton professor Will Haffer to replace John Holdren as the science czar. Haffer's already met with Trump. He's in the top 2 people considered for it. And I think that would be a game changer because the media couldn't ignore it. Haffer's outspoken. Haffer is unbelievably credentialed. He's got, well in excess of 200, maybe 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers. He's a physicist from Princeton. He is in your face. He debated Bill Nye on CNN about 2 months ago. He's just aggressive. He's right, and he's articulate. And I can't think of anything else Donald Trump could do than to put in Will Happer as a science writer. Unfortunately, Trump is way behind it. The whole science office has just floundered and it's sort of shut down. Nothing's happening with it right now. I really hope he resurrects it. What I don't want to happen is just some milquetoast scientist to come in and not, seize the bull by the horns. And if it's not Will Happer, that's what's likely to happen.
I agree, and I've met Dr. Happer. Actually, he was at our Inconvenient Lie Third Congress of Freedom Force last winter, and there is a DVD out that's available through Freedom Force International on that called Inconvenient Lie, and Dr. Happer and Dr. Tim Ball are both on that, as well as I think even clips from your movie are included in that DVD.
Yeah.
So in any case, I hate to say it, but we're at the end. We've gone well past our hour, but we started in kind of a strange way. But Mark, you were absolutely phenomenal. Your energy and your interest in this subject is just phenomenal, and I really appreciate you being on this call. It started out as a rather difficult situation, and you took care of that with some great dialogue. As I said earlier, I agree with everything you say. You're spot on this issue, and it is all tied to UN Agenda 21. It's all tied to literally total control of our society and deindustrialization of the West. And if anybody can look at this and not see the fingers of communism and fascism or whatever other control isms all over this effort, they're missing the boat. So, Mark, I want to thank you again. Is there anything you'd like to tell our listeners before we sign off?
Well, yeah, climatedepot.com is where you can get the latest on stuff, all my coverage of Al Gore's sequel, which I'll be seeing this weekend, and also climatehustle.com. You can go and order the film DVD, Blu-ray, and on demand. And I hope your listeners get a chance to watch that, Dan, because I think they'll enjoy it. We try to make it an entertaining film on climate. And the only other thing I'm going to say is I apologize if I've garbled the 25-year-old history of is it actually 25 years or 35? 25-year-old history of the Earth Summit. I've got to do some reading on that, and I apologize if I misconstrued the history of that.
No. You do fine. The fact is that any way you look at it, we're in a fight for our lives, and you are one of the generals that are leading the opposition, and I thank goodness we've got people like you that are willing to do that. So I really appreciate your being on the call. I'd love to try to do this again when we don't have all these technical issues. If you'd be willing to do that, I'd love to have you on a conversation because you're such a great guest, and frankly, you're fired up the way all of America ought to be fired up over this issue.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Enjoyed it, and I'm sure when you get Tim Ball on, he's a fantastic guest as well. I've known Tim for years now. So.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. But thanks again, Mark, and with that, I'll turn the show over and thank our listeners for joining us, and join us next week, and we'll have another Connecting the Dots program that will help you to understand what's really happening to our country. With that, good night, and thank you again.
Thank you, Dan. Join us next week, 6 p.m. Pacific on Thursday, and everyone have a great weekend. Bye-bye. weekend. Bye-bye.